We often imagine the fall of Rome as a single, cataclysmic night. The sound of splintering wood, the roar of barbarian tribes, and the sky turned orange by the fires of a burning capital. But history is rarely that loud. The Roman Empire didn't just explode, it eroded. It was a slow-motion crash that took centuries to complete. While the legions were still marching and the elites were still feasting in their marble villas, the invisible foundations of the world were turning to dust. This wasn't a tragedy of war, it was a tragedy of math. Tonight, we look past the battlefields and into the ledgers of the ancient world to understand why the greatest empire in history simply couldn't afford to exist anymore. To understand the crash, we must look at the silver denarius. At the peak of the empire under Augustus, the denarius was nearly pure silver. It was the dollar of the ancient world, the bedrock of trust. But as the borders grew too long to defend and the bureaucracy too large to feed, Rome ran out of silver. The solution was a desperate, silent fraud: debasement. Emperors began clipping the coins, mixing silver with cheap copper. By the time of the crisis of the 3rd century, the denarius was little more than a silver-washed copper slug. Inflation didn't just rise, it mutated. Prices for basic grains skyrocketed by 1,000%. Trust, the most valuable currency of any civilization, vanished. When a soldier realizes his pay can no longer buy bread, he stops fighting for the empire and starts fighting for the highest bidder. Rome's soul was sold for a percentage of copper. As the currency collapsed, the state grew more desperate. The army needed more pay to keep up with inflation, so taxes were hiked to levels that bordered on theft. The casualties of this policy were the curiales, the educated, land-owning middle class who ran the cities. They were made personally responsible for tax shortfalls. If the city couldn't pay, the officials had to pay from their own pockets. The result? The middle class fled. They abandoned their homes, their titles, and their responsibilities. This created the Great Flight to the countryside. Wealthy elites retreated to massive, self-sufficient estates called villas. They stopped paying taxes, stopped supporting the central government, and turned their workers into serfs. Globalization was reversing. The world was shrinking from a Mediterranean-wide network into isolated pockets of feudalism. Rome's economy was built on a fatal flaw. It was an engine fueled by conquest. As long as the legions were winning, the empire had a constant influx of cheap slave labor. This was Rome's cheap energy. But when the expansion stopped, the supply of slaves dried up. Labor costs exploded. Instead of innovating, instead of building machines or improving technology, Rome had relied on human muscle for too long. Without new slaves, the massive industrial farms, the latifundia, became unprofitable. The agricultural heart of the empire stopped beating. The empire was like a shark that had to keep swimming to breathe. The moment it stopped moving forward, it began to drown in its own inefficiency. By the 4th century, the Roman government had become a sprawling, parasitic entity. The ratio of tax eaters to taxpayers had shifted dangerously. To manage the chaos, the empire was split in two, doubling the number of courts, administrators, and emperors. The bureaucracy became a quiet luxury for the elite and a death sentence for the commoner. Regulations became so stifling that sons were legally forced to take up the professions of their fathers just to keep the economy moving. Social mobility died. Creativity died. The empire wasn't a living thing anymore. It was a ghost encased in ironclad laws. When the Goths finally walked through the gates of Rome in 410 AD, they didn't find a titan. They found a hollow shell. The infrastructure was crumbling, the treasury was empty, and the citizens were so burdened by their own government that many actually welcomed the barbarians as liberators from the Roman tax collector. The fall of Rome wasn't an ending, it was a bankruptcy. It reminds us that no amount of military might can save a society that has rotted from within. The statues still stood, and the titles were still spoken. But the economy, the lifeblood of the world, had already stopped flowing. Rome didn't fall to a sword, it fell to a ledger.